From Hamilton Place Strategies in Washington, D.C., this is the HPS Insights podcast.
Welcome to HPS Insights, a podcast from Hamilton Place Strategies, analyzing the current events impacting the business and political communities. We're your hosts, Tony Fratto and Stephanie Dodge.
Today, we'll be speaking with Fanta Traore, Executive Director of the Sadie Collective, about the Cross-Policy School White Paper on Anti-Racism that she wrote in collaboration with researchers across several universities. Several of the members of that working group are also joining us today. I'll give Fanta a moment to introduce herself and the researchers.
My name is Fanta Traore, and I am the Executive Director and co-founder of the Sadie Collective, where I build talent pipelines into economics and related fields of public policy, finance, and data science. The researchers that I am joined with today are Young Chan, as well as Doug, who are with the Ford School. Other researchers who have been a part of this effort include representatives from Duke University, Harvard University, University of Michigan, New York University, UC Berkeley, and Yale University's policy programs.
Fanta, I know you mentioned when we were in earlier conversations about this that Malcolm Gladwell's work helped inspire your interest in doing this on a podcast. How so? How did it connect to doing it with respect to a white paper?
So as many of us know, Malcolm Gladwell is an investigative journalist, speaker, and writer who regularly inspires public discourse. He is known for his book, Outlier, and a few other best-selling texts. During the summer of 2021, he released 2 podcast episodes where he debunked the algorithm for how schools are ranked in the U.S. News Rankings annual report. In doing so, as a part of his podcast called Revisionist History, he created 2 episodes, the first called Lord of the Rankings, and then the other called Project Dillard. And in those, he takes a look at the algorithm that defines how schools are ranked. Many of us who have considered university, have graduated with a bachelor's, have taken a look at this ranking system to help to inform our own decision making. And what he finds is some of the metrics that go into the actual algorithm for assessing a school are problematic and not reflective of how good the school actually is. So for instance, he looks at the size of a school's endowment and finds that it's highly correlated with the number of white students on campus. He also finds that the graduation rate has more to do with where a student is coming from as opposed to how good the school actually is. The average alumni giving rate also helps to inform the ranking systems for the school, which isn't necessarily reflective of the quality of the education that's there. And what he finds is that when it comes to HBCUs, they are doing incredibly poorly on this ranking system. And that's because history and the policies that have enabled HBCUs to exist play a large role. So for instance, Dillard University is ranked poorly when we look at the US News and Rankings system. However, when it comes to its impact in the Black community, it's large and quite impactful. So what we're finding is that around 300 Black undergraduate students are at Harvard. However, 5 of those are Black physics grads, whereas at Dillard, you are getting 35 Black students who are majoring and graduating with a physics degree every year. And so what this shows is that when it comes to attrition for STEM students who are coming from historically marginalized backgrounds, that they are faring better at HBCUs. And the US News and Ranking system does not capture this. And so it goes to show that the metrics that are used to determine the rankings for different schools and programs does not capture how impactful that institution can be in that individual student's lives. And so the reason why I shared that inspired me for this podcast is because our national coalition of diversity, equity, and inclusion student reps are doing similar work to debunking that ranking system, because we're looking at what schools should be valuing in order to create the best policy leaders in the world.
It is so important. I'll tell you just personally, I sit on the board of visitors of the graduate school I attended. So I just telling you from the other side, we had our board of visitors meetings with the dean and some other officials from schools. I should put a plug in for the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. And excellent meeting, but absolutely, we are looking at our rankings on these lists, and we know what it means for our ability to attract students. So it is relevant on both sides that these kinds of assessments and rankings are correct, right? And when I say correct, I mean relevant, but also not disadvantaging any community anywhere. And it's a very controversial topic at so many schools.
And I think this is Young Chen, by the way, also so lucky and privileged and so blessed to be here. Again, I'm a first-year Master of Public Policy student in the University of Michigan. The school ranking is such an interesting realm and a spectrum to explore for me, because when a school has high ranking, I think there is also a value judgment that comes with it. If a school is highly ranked, Harvard, Yale, UCLA, Berkeley, Michigan, yes, they are great schools. Therefore, what they do must be great. What they're not doing must not be important. And I think before we can even do the long, hard work about delineating those two, for now, we have to do that incremental change of showing that high-ranking schools do not always do things well and do not always do things that they should do. And I think that's why the Sadie Collective's work is just so valuable for me.
So can we dive into that a little bit more about just how on this the very specific question of REI, race, equity, inclusion, in particular, look at all institutions, right? We're talking about law school, we could talk about MBA programs, we could be talking about medical schools, but in particular for schools of public policy, why particularly relevant for schools of public policy?
Schools of public policy are concerned with public service. And that's a big part of the selling point of Masters in Public Policy programs, that you are going into an institution that is going to prepare you to go into government, to work at a think tank, to work at a multilateral institution, all institutions that are powerful and influential in shaping our daily lives. And the reason why this group has been interested in the racial equity and inclusion lens, as opposed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I should name outright, is because the conversation of diversity often takes away from the need to address the historical exclusion that comes with race into those same spaces that Masters in Public Policy programs are looking to go into. So, for instance, the World Trade Organization has Dr. Ngozi at the helm now, the first Black woman to do so. However, when we think about the long spectrum of how long the World Trade Organization has been around and the presence of formerly colonized nations and their leadership being a part of it, that means that we're looking at an exclusion over time, and that's because of history. And so racial equity and inclusion is concerned with history and correcting it through having an emphasis on including races that have been historically excluded, whether that is in the context of the United States or more broadly in the conversation internationally around decolonization. So we are interested in seeing our policy programs center these needs, because what often happens is that students who are coming from marginalized backgrounds are doing the heavy lifting of pushing their schools to have more diversity in faculty, to have more diversity in staff, in the course content and curriculum, because of the fact that it isn't there. With a lot of the schools that we have taken a look at the data at, we've found that there is little to no Black faculty represented. And this means that there is perspective that's not being pushed forth. And one could say that, yes, if you're looking at diversity, you can still push that conversation forward. However, we've been doing that, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a new term, and racial equity allows us to pay attention to those nuances that come with the racialized nature of the world and to keep that front and center in pushing policy conversations forward.
I love that you asked that you referenced Madam Ngozi in particular for that, because she's been an important role model in multiple roles now. And I think I remember meeting with her as she was finance minister of Nigeria at the World Bank. On my board of, we sit on the same board of directors at the Center for Global Development, so lending her voice that way. But most importantly, she's a brilliant economist, economic thinker also. And so she brings all of that, from where she stands and her, the things that she has seen with her eyes and tried to experience from, a country are just so important to all of the policy making and all the places that she has she has sat, and in some ways she's the one of the most important examples. But as we know, our schools of public policy, that Ford School, are putting people at all levels of government everywhere, globally and locally, and all of them are truly important. But Doug, I see you had your hand raised.
Oh yeah, I was just going to add to what Fanta said that policymakers enact wide-ranging social, economic, and health policies that disproportionately impact Black and Indigenous and people of color. So in order to address that history of racism, the history of colonialism, we really need to have equity lens in policy. And we're not really, from the research and data that we've collected, a lot of students feel that we don't have that equity lens. And if we don't have that equity lens, how are we going to address historical disparities? How are we going to make sure that we're not perpetuating racism? How are we going to make sure we're not perpetuating structural inequality?
Doug and Yanchan on this also is because you guys are at the Ford School, which is noted for University of Michigan. You all are the, it's like I think of it as the greatest stats-based, evidence-based public policy school, and your dean, Michael Barr, is just one of the really great adherents to thinking about measuring. What did you learn from, and how does that in the working paper? How do you think about measuring and data? When what did you discover, or how did you think about it in the work that you did?
I see. So we are actually on Zoom, and I see Doug with his camera on, very pensive looking. So I'm going to talk a little bit to give him time to think. And I'm going to actually cheat a little bit and go back to the first question you asked, and then make my way slowly into what you just asked me. In terms of why REI matters for public policy, I'm going to cheat yet again and talk about why REI matters generally, and then for public policy, and then why that goes into data for me. REI really matters because it's not intuitive for us, and it really shouldn't be. We all occupy a very unique sociocultural space. We have our very specific identities, and those identities have allowed us or prohibited certain opportunities and upbringing and childhood and trauma and the way that we process information. We're all 8 billion different people. And that means that none of us know all the identities and all the traumas and all the experiences. REI is not intuitive for us, which is why we need a very explicit structural way to make sure that it is ingrained into us. Because to me, REI and DEI are very compassionate lenses to build rapport and relationships. In public policy, that matters even more because of what Doug and Fanta shared. It has a very real effect on people's lives and livelihoods. We know that public policy people, economists, are the ones who coined the term deserving or undeserving when we talk about social insurance and social safety nets. We know that people of these backgrounds are the ones who coined the term moral hazard, which is usually used to describe how poor people's behaviors change when they receive certain benefits and social safety nets. These phrases, albeit with neutral denotations, their connotations from the word that they choose are very telling. So we need to make sure that there is REI in future decision makers and current decision makers who are right now determining whether certain people's bodies are their own, whether certain economic choices are other people's or their own choices. So when we look at data, to go back to your question, working under and learning from Michael Barr and the amazing faculty and the deans and amazing colleagues and my own training, although data is so important, and Ford School has really taught me to look at different cross sections to know how one thing affects different groups differently, I've also been really privileged and blessed to engage with the work of white supremacist culture. And there are 10 to 15 tenets of white supremacist culture, and quantity over quality, and or another way to say that is quantification, is actually a tenet of it. This not obsession, but maybe this prioritization, maybe the weighting more heavily on numbers and experiences and qualitative data. That is what white supremacy is, because MBA's public policy and decision-making spaces have always told us numbers are what matters. The bottom line is what matters. But I think this is why our work was so important, because the white paper really, really emphasizes the numbers, yes, absolutely, and the qualitative data on what the students are telling us about their individual experiences, because words matter. So I think I've been so lucky to be in a space and in an academic institution that values and really promotes both quantification and the qualitative analyses.
In your words, ring particularly true after the events of this past weekend in Buffalo, obviously. We're going to take a break right here, and we'll come back on HPS Insights.
Every Friday, Hamilton Place Strategies founding partner Tony Fratto joins John Fagan and Brendan Walsh of Markets Policy Partners for the HPS Macrocast, an in-depth look at the macroeconomic news driving the week. Check out the latest episode at hamiltonplacestrategies.com/podcast.
Welcome back to HPS Insights. I'm your host, Stephanie, and I'm here with the working group behind the Cross Policy School white paper on anti-racism. So I'm curious, tell us about your team's collaboration through the Sadie Collective and your future plans to work with universities to help them understand where improvements can be made.
I think one of the goals of this paper, or two, I should say, is to spark conversation first, and second, to create a tool for accountability for our respective schools. And again, reiterating, knowing that Fanta and Doug bring their own expertise and insights, I will wait for them to definitely add on to and kind of correct where I might stumble. I think to fine-tune the spotlight, I think, onto University of Michigan first, I am really thankful to have worked with a wonderful team for our campus, Crystal Olalde Garcia, Doug Ortiz, who's with me right now, and Maya O'Meara. And in addition to the graduate student volunteers, our UMich team, University of Michigan team, also had admin support, actually, and we were so grateful for that from our public policy schools Center for Racial Justice, and the staff of Dr. Celeste Watkins-Hayes, who's also the Associate Dean for the Public Policy School, Dominique Adams-Santos, and Sharanya Pai. And really through Center for Racial Justice's support through funding and access to admin's ears, our team is right now producing our own analysis paper, and we have presented in the annual DEI mini conference in our campus using our own campus's data. And in that space, we actually heard from personnel from schools of information and public health on their interest in our data, our findings, recommendations, which we saw personally as encouraging signals that our work is valued, necessary, and impactful. So in our campus, I think navigating change looks like preparing ourselves with data, becoming topical experts, brainstorming recommendations among allies, and becoming more of a scalpel than a sledgehammer in conversations by asking questions and embodying that real genuine respect and curiosity for the context of why things have been done, why things haven't been done, what's been tried, what resources we have or might need, and what the institution's priorities are. And really speaking for just myself, it is something that I'm still actually learning. And I feel honestly very privileged and lucky to be surrounded by trusted loved ones who really helped me through the growth pains. And kind of like now stepping back to to appreciate the full picture and vision. I think Fanta's phrasing and our previous conversations, I really want to honor her insight, I think, that our goal is to, again, spark a conversation and create a tool for accountability. And while our white paper really lays out our most idealistic recommendations on a high level, we know that each campus's institutional navigation looks very different. We're trusting the current and prospective students then to navigate these systems as they see fit to cater for them. So ultimately, to revisit the phrasing of the question, like, how do we plan to work with universities and how to continue that work? I'd say we plan to work with universities through proxy agents and volunteers of student orgs and individual students who we empower with our insights so they can cater their recommendations, conversations, and approaches as they see fit. And I am honestly thrilled for Fanta and the Sadie Collective on how they will continue and evolve this work in the coming years.
That's wonderful. And you kind of previewed my next question in your response. And Fanta, maybe you'll jump in here, but to you all, what does actionable progress look like at policy schools in terms of REI initiatives for the next 10 years, by administration, faculty, and students alike?
So first, I want to touch on where does the Sadie Collective come in on this issue, and then I'll go into what next steps look like and relate it to what Young Chan shared, the importance of accountability. So the Sadie Collective is generally focused on getting more Black women into economics and related fields. And the reason why we stepped in to support on this project is because we see our members going into Masters in Public Policy programs and using the tools of economic analysis in order to create change. And in doing so, the work that we are all doing here of quantifying the impact of the lack of racial equity and inclusion within our curriculum is relevant for the Black women within our community. And so in 2020, when I went into my master's in public policy program and noticed that there was this lack of focus on racial equity and inclusion, and came across this group, which was mobilized prior to me joining my program, it was a space for myself and other like-minded people to consider this question of accountability. And because at that time, the Sadie Collective had some resources to support, we stepped in. And what I've mentioned to the team prior is that this work of students who have marginalized identities, who are low income, who are first generation, who are trying to make a way for themselves in these programs has been happening time and time again. And our goal with participating is to sort of end that trend of schools having students who come in who are passionate about these issues, then graduate, and then those schools forget about resolving these important problems by creating accountability. And so what are we doing? We are presenting this data widely for the world to see and are looking to update it on a regular basis so that it's available for prospective students who deserve to know how their schools are prioritizing the schools that they may be interested in are prioritizing racial equity and inclusion, to create a mechanism that alum can also look to and use that to inform how they engage with their alma maters, and then also create a tool for faculty and staff to look across different institutions and see how they can be more thoughtful about creating environments by learning from what those other institutions are doing. So when this coalition got together in 2020, that's what we were doing. We were sharing the insights that we learned from other schools. So I was learning from the Ford School diversity, equity, and inclusion reps on what they were doing. Columbia University students who are also involved have shared how they've been able to push conversation, and we've been able to cross-pollinate ideas on what next steps for our institutions can be on accountability, because some of our schools have released statements as a result of 2020 around what the future holds for centering racial equity. But as far as the accountability piece, there has been room for more transparency on what that looks like. And our hope is that we do not continue to have students going through these programs having to have these conversations again and take on the unpaid labor that comes with getting our schools to make a change as it relates to this. So for instance, around 800 additional hours, in addition to being a student, taking coursework, looking for internships, looking for jobs, were put into this work. And that shouldn't have to be the case. And so that's some of the hope for the next steps of this work, and to create a value system that centers different ideas, like Young Chan mentioned so eloquently earlier, around how we assess schools. Just because a school is ranked highly doesn't mean that it's great. And there is still work that needs to be done, especially when we consider the numbers that we're seeing around diversity for faculty. Some of our schools have no Black faculty who are tenured, and that needs to change because tenured faculty members have the ability to push the strategic direction of an institution. They have stake in how hiring processes go for that school. And if these schools do not adapt and recognize that the world population is not well represented in some of their global oriented programs, then they're going to lose good students, but also they're going to continue to perpetuate the system of white supremacy that should be dismantled.
Fanta, what does that ideal policy program look like when it incorporates the REI lens that we want, including, you talked a little bit about the faculty, but is it, the tenured faculty who are there, the courses that are taught, what does that ideal public policy program look like?
So one, it would incorporate the lived experiences of the global majority. And in doing so, that looks like having one of the recommendations that our coalition has made, which is requiring a mandatory course that centers an understanding of racial equity, decolonization, and inclusion for all students. That's one recommendation from our group. The second recommendation would be creating accountability for measuring how change is occurring for the racial diversity of staff and faculty. Faculty and staff have a great stake in our programs, and they should represent the world. And at this time, we are seeing most of our programs have 70% or more tenured faculty who are white, as opposed to centering the demographics of the world, which would include at least 20% who are of African descent. And that's with consideration of Brazil, which has the largest racial group of African descent outside of Africa. We're looking at 1 billion people in the African continent. There should be African professors at these schools. We're also looking at the Black population in the United States and then the diaspora more broadly. So that's just one example of what expectations are when it comes to what having a truly global policy program would look like.
Directly connecting and building off of what Fanta said, I think the word accountability is something that rings very true for me. We know that professors, especially in R1 universities, basically universities that really prioritize putting out research and publications and conferences and all those things, the evaluative metrics for professors is more so on the research that they produce rather than their quality of teaching. And DEI, REI are really not on their evaluative metrics. They are not evaluated on whether or not they incorporate REI into their work. So I think when we talk about accountability, which is what Stephanie asked, which is what Fanta talked about, which is what Doug and I talk about in our private conversations, we need to structurally place REI and DEI into how somebody is evaluated. We need to make sure that pay scales, promotions, tenure tracks, evaluations, all these things are tied back into REI. Because again, a phrase that I mentioned before, value judgment, we implicitly and explicitly say this is what matters and this is what does not matter when we look at how somebody's performance is measured. In terms of Stephanie's original question of what does an idealistic program looks like, for me, coming from a higher ed background, DEI analysis work, working in nonprofits, I really like the microscopic relational lens. Using that lens, for me, an ideal public policy program looks like one where allyship is about taking time to learn the issues and really, of course, for non-Black, non-Indigenous people of color, but especially for our white allies, taking time to learn the issues and using that privilege to show your support publicly and privately. I am not interested in white allies who text me individually after something racist has happened in classrooms, telling me, Young Chan, that was so messed up. Thank you so much for speaking up. This is really bad. I'm not interested in that touching base after the fact. I want you to speak up for me in that moment. I want you to use that privilege of your skin color and your legitimized institutional presence to say, wow, what Young Chan just told us in public is great. And I want to legitimize this and to give space to that too. Don't come to me afterwards. I also want folks, including myself, to learn to be and to really love to be uncomfortable, because allyship is a lifelong learning process. All of us sitting in this space have messed up, and that's okay. I mess up daily, and we will all continue to mess up. Messing up is not what's important. It is important that we learn and that we don't repeat that mistake. Because yes, learning always happens, but at what cost? Which is a line that our colleague Crystal Olalde Garcia has said before. Learning happens, yes, but it shouldn't be always at the cost of marginalized folks. And I know Doug raised his hand, and I really am excited to hear from him.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about some of the things that our school, the Ford School, has been doing pretty great with in terms of just REI and racial diversity. I want to just mention that a lot of students of color at the Ford student, as students from diverse backgrounds, have been given fellowships and funding to attend the university, such as myself, to go into policy programs. And so they are doing things to bring in more BIPOC and students from low income backgrounds into the program for sure. And we also have Stephanie Sanders, a great person who at the Ford School, and D&I officer, and a dean at the Ford School as well, who's doing a lot of great work training the faculty to incorporate an equity lens and to better handle bias in the classroom and make classrooms more inclusive. And then the Ford School is also, they're incorporating anti-racism throughout the entire curriculum. So those are some of the things that they are doing a great job at. I think we do have to recognize that policy schools are still nested in predominantly white institutions that they have perpetuated inequality, and they do have histories of colonialism and structural racism as well. So that needs to be acknowledged. And then I think also that a lot of this data we collected ourselves. So I think really incorporating the students as in some of this idea generation around D&I, I think is really important, especially to make these places more inclusive for BIPOC students, to make them inclusive of students for disabilities and all other kinds of historically marginalized identity groups.
Doug makes a really great point around the efforts that schools are taking, and I think that is important to note. We are in these programs, we are working with staff and faculty who want to see change. And as you all will take a look at this white paper that we have coming out this week, I'd like for you to consider the 4 components that we have as a part of it, and to create your own value judgments around the insights that we are gathering, which are guided by data and guided by the perspectives of students on their campuses. So first, we review demographic data of staff and faculty, which takes a look at diversity as it relates to race and gender, and considers the role of those in school governance in guiding a school's strategic direction and hiring. We also take a look at the courses that students are required to take and present our view on what the ideal scenario looks like. We take a look at data from at least 8 different policy programs with nearly 900 students who share their perspectives around racial equity and inclusion for their programs. And then finally, we look at a broader set of questions to get a sense of what racial equity looks like on that campus. So for instance, around the killing of George Floyd, did the school release a plan of action to address racial inequity? So that is our paper, and we look forward to getting insights from everyone around the data that you see around public policy programs and the work that is ahead of us.
No, absolutely. Well, thank you all so much. And this has just been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for allowing me specifically and HPS Insights to be a part of it. Thank you to Fanta, Youngchin, and Doug for taking the time. And of course, thank you to our audience for tuning in to another episode of HPS Insights. You can find out more about Hamilton Place Strategies work and our podcast at hamiltonplacestrategies.com or by following us on Twitter at HPS Insight. We're your hosts, Tony Fratto and Stephanie Dodge. And as always, thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to the HPS Insights podcast, produced by Hamilton Place Strategies. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at HPS Insights and follow us on the web at hamiltonplacestrategies.com.